Number 1.
This story takes place in August of 2013 in the mountains of southern Oregon. I'm a UCAF Security Forces airman, military policeman that is. My girlfriend was at work, and as the swelteringly hot day began to turn into thunderstorms, my buddy Nick, another military cop, and I decided to explore some back roads and get out of the heat in town. Southern Oregon is crisscrossed with logging roads, some actively used and many totally forgotten and grown over. Nick and I spent many of our days off, starting on roads that we knew, finding roads we didn't know, driving for hours into the mountains, and eventually navigating back to paved roads. On this particular day, with storm clouds building over the mountains, we set off on a road that we've never been on and began the drive into the mountains. After driving for around an hour, we hadn't seen nor heard any signs of other people in the woods. We rounded a bend in the thick fir woods and emerged in a meadow that was totally surrounded by thick aspen groves. The meadow was perfectly flat and eerily still. We both noticed a strange stillness almost immediately. No birds, hardly any insect noise, no squirrels, and certainly no other people. On the far side of the meadow, right at the edge of the tree line, there was a picnic table. The table was very odd, however. It was painted a bright orange and was much larger than a typical picnic table in a park. Remarking on this, Nick drove through the meadow to get a closer look. I remember being apprehensive as we approached. The whole scenario was exceptionally strange. The overall silence of the aspen grove was unsettling. Also, it was nearly impossible to see far into the trees as aspens grow extremely close together. When we parked by the table, I hopped out of the passenger seat of the truck to check it out. I'm not very tall, only about 5'5". Regardless, the table was ridiculously oversized and practically unusable. The seats were nearly at chest level, meaning I would have to climb up to even sit on them. As I was looking at the table, Nick called me over to the truck, and I noticed he was looking back into the aspens. At first, I couldn't see what he was looking at, but then I noticed a splash of color that was completely out of place in the thick trees. A small, one-man tent was set back in the trees, about 50 feet from the strange table. I had an initial feeling of dread and felt uncertain that someone was in the tent, and if we could see the tent, they could see us. There were no campgrounds in this area, no people, no main roads for miles. Surely, someone camping so remotely would be, at the very least, a strange person. However, as we observed the tent, we didn't see any movement or hear any sounds coming from it. Nick suggested I call out. I didn't want to, but I did. "Hey, anyone in there?" I yelled. No reply. Feeling completely on edge, Nick and I thought about driving away and leaving this strange area. But we began to fear the worst. What if there was a body in the tent? What if somebody had gotten kidnapped? Foolish, I know, but we thought it, all the same. After some debate, we decided to have Nick turn the truck around to drive away from the camp. Should we leave in a hurry, he would be waiting behind the wheel. With my heart pounding, I started walking through the trees towards the tent. I was totally keyed up with my senses on full alert. When I reached what was supposed to be a campsite, several things struck me as odd. Backpacks were scattered all over. No fire had been built, no wood collected. The tent was literally full of backpacks and women's clothing. Full of dread, I turned to leave and tell Nick what I had seen. As I left, I heard Nick start yelling, "Let's go! Let's get the fuck out of here!" Not knowing why he was yelling, I ran back to the truck. When I broke out of the trees, I saw a beat-up old Ford Taurus on the road, blocking us from leaving the meadow. I immediately leapt into the passenger seat and Nick floored the gas pedal. The car was occupied by 2 men. A third person was laying against the window in the back. As we drove across the meadow, the driver attempted to block us from the road, but Nick drove around them and accelerated the way that we had come from. I looked back and saw the car attempting to turn around on the narrow road. Nick drove like a madman, and I honestly thought that they would catch up to us. We hit the highway, and then we didn't see the car again. I still don't know if the person in the back was male or female. I called the state police, and they promised to send a trooper out to check out the scene. However, I received a call the next day from a trooper stating that the campsite, the backpacks, the women's clothing was all gone, though he could tell that people had been in the area. The strange table was still by the thick aspen grove. I have not returned to the area and do not intend to.
Number 2.
This happened to me a few years ago, and I don't often talk about it since it's weird and gory, and not the kind of story that you whip out at cocktail parties or something. But here it goes. A couple of years ago, I was stressed out from college and the big city life, and decided to spend a long weekend in the woods, doing what my city friends consider utter lunacy, and us outdoorsy people consider nirvana. Deep woods free, camping in the winter, alone. While this sounds like the beginning of a missing persons report, if you're an experienced outdoorsman, it's pretty safe. I also take a secret pleasure in being the white trash warrioress my dad always hoped I'd be. I always hated the feeling of claustrophobia that came with being a female in the city, avoiding eye contact, not walking alone at night. When you're a girl alone out in the woods, you're in charge. You're safe within the warm embrace of your own solitary freedom. Or so I thought. I spent a few hours on the roads, the surroundings getting wilder and wilder as I drove. I parked in an allowed roadside ditch, and with a compass and a map, hiked until I was in a mile's reach or so of some good ice fishing. I was at least 4 miles from the road. I made an extremely discreet camp in a clearing with just one little hole in the snow for my tiny tent and my tiny campfire. After a couple beautiful days of just hiking and relaxing around the camp, I made the trek to the fishing hole. Everything was in utter winter stillness. The air was crisp, and the only signs that I wasn't in a perfect vacuum were the twitterings of birds and the very distant rumblings of the half-frozen waterfalls. After a mile or so of crunching along in the snow, I silently celebrated my compass skills when I came out to the exact place I had intended to. I punched the hole in the thin crust of ice and set to getting my fish on. My first catch came quickly. After a few weeks under a frozen surface, the fish are very hungry. I was feeling oddly fatigued and jumpy, so I decided to just clean the fish here and now and take it straight back to the camp to cook. I quickly realized that my fish preparation skills were rusty at best. I cursed my lack of preparation as I cut myself for the second time. Something in my peripheral senses were irritating me, that I was very set in my task, focusing on the motions in the slippery mess. The thing in periphery was growing more irritating, like the buzzing of a fly or the yammering of a sibling. I carved and hacked and sliced my hand open freshly as the fish slipped out of my hands and into the snow. Frustrated, I shouted, "Fuck off with that whistling, will you?" Silence resumed, and then my heart stopped. Living in a college neighborhood, I had grown so accustomed to white noise that I had failed to recognize how grossly inappropriate this sound was in this context. The silence weighed down on me as I broke into a sweat. The only reason a human would be this deep in the woods would be to hunt, and no hunter would ever give himself away like that. And if he was whistling for any other reason, shouldn't he have reacted to my outburst? Yelled something vulgar back? Apologized? No, nothing. Just the total stillness of the woods. Silence as pure as it was before I spoke. Unsure if I had misheard the twitterings of a bird or something, I just decided that the fish was a lost cause, slung my gear over my shoulder and headed for camp. I trudged over in the woods, and about a quarter mile from camp, I saw a large mass protruding from the snow. Apprehensive but drawn, like a moth to the flame, I trudged up to what materialized in the closing distance as a moose kill. A really good moose kill. A clean shot through the upturned eye, staring at me and saying something that was imposing a sense of dread on me, but a dread I couldn't translate. I ran hard and I ran fast. In the snow and the woods everything looks the same. I knew I was moving south, and I knew I'd passed camp on the east. I made for the road, eventually slowing down to a weary trudge, calming in the comforting sight of the woods clearing ahead to make way for the country road. I looked to my left and saw my car 50 yards or so down, jogged to it and drove the only 15 miles to the first motel I saw signs for. I had none of my belongings and no earthly idea why I had just abandoned the ship like that. It was only as I was sitting up and watching infomercials that night that it started to fall together. Why would the Park Services issue free camp passes for the same stretch of woods that they allowed hunting? The moose defied everything of my rudimentary understanding of hunting. And even with the snow to cool it, decomposition starts quickly on an animal that size. You'd have time for a few quick pictures, but you'd want to have it dressed quickly. Why would you kill a moose 5 miles into the forest? And how would you ever drag it back to the road? In the morning, in a sleep-deprived and paranoid state, I described everything I'd seen and thought I heard to a very confused park ranger. He seemed more vexed about legal hunting than any of my crazy city girl ramblings. He said he wanted to come pick me up and have me take him to where I thought the kill site was. I said I was only going if he brought a gun. He sighed with exasperation and told me when to meet him. We rode out into the woods on an ATV, with me awkwardly riding on the back as if on the back of the world's most awkward motorcycle. We got to a large impression in the snow where the moose had been. Blood was everywhere. There was also the distinct track of the carcass being dragged. The drag marks made a smooth trail in the snow, as if the carcass were on a tarp. The ranger said he should take me back now. He asked me where my camp was, and I pointed in the direction of the drag marks. It looked like he was finally sharing in my unease. Back at the hotel, I washed my clothes in the sink and prepared to drive home in the morning. An unknown number called my phone. It was the park ranger. The moose had been dragged to my campsite apparently. He described the scene as a huge mess. He wasn't sure if an animal had helped to make the mess, but one thing was clear. Someone had cut into my tent with a knife. I asked about the rest of my belongings. He said darkly, "You don't want them back. They covered in moose mess." "So, what happens now?" "Well, miss, we're just gonna keep an eye out for this guy. I haven't heard of or seen anything like this before. I'm really sorry this happened." And that was it. No closure, no explanation. In the years that have passed, I've tried very different applications of reason. A hunter who needed help, but knew I was already gone? A deranged psychopath looking to make his second kill? One of the few friends I shared the story with envisioned him as some deep-woods Sweeney Todd. He dubbed him Moosey Todd. I still don't know why I didn't hear the gunshot though. The whistling seems so vivid in my memory, but was it even real? One question has been definitely answered, and I'll never go into the woods alone again.
Number 3.
This happened around 16 years ago. I was 12 then. I was in the summer camp of my Boy Scout troop, but with both boys and girls, since we're in Spain. One of the most important activities during the summer camp is what we called the raid. Basically going out of the camp to adventurously trek for a couple of days. My friends and I planned an amazing route through a beautiful mountain range called Pyrenees, in the northeast of Spain. 3 days walking, 2 nights sleeping out at camp. My raid group consisted of 15 boys and girls, all between 12 and 14 years old. We took food with us, knew how to read a map, how to build a shelter, how to search for water, and pretty much anything necessary to survive for a couple of days. So no adults were coming out with us. This doesn't happen anymore. Our plans for the first day were to climb a mountain that was just under 3,000 meters, about 10,000 feet high, and sleep by a glacial lake nearly on top of it. It was a long walk from our camp, about 25 kilometers, 15 miles, and quite steep. So, at about 6 PM, we decided we were not going to reach the lake at a prudent time. We found a nice place to build a shelter, did it, and then cooked some dinner. We were in the middle of a beautiful mountain, about 10 kilometers, 6 miles from the nearest road, and let's add 5 kilometers more from the closest village. We couldn't have been happier. We still had nearly 2 hours until sunset when we finished our meal. So we thought it was a good idea to send a smaller group to clean dishes and refill water to a spring we had seen while walking. I volunteered to go and 3 others joined. We got a couple of light torches too, just in case, and headed towards the fountain. Night came while we were on our way back to the shelter. We could hear the rest of our group singing and having fun in the distance. Suddenly, one of my friends stopped and pointed at something just by the side of our trail. "This wasn't here on our way down, I'm fucking sure," he said. There was a light reflecting pole from the road, torn into pieces. We went from being happy and relaxed to being mildly scared in just a second, and rushed all the way to where the rest of our friends were. We told them about our creepy finding right away. We were just kids, so fear escalated quite fast. Who could be hiding in the same mountain we were at, and why? Two of the older guys, they were 14 years old, thought it would be a good idea to go and take a look around to try and calm us down. Although being without them was even scarier, we also appreciated it. They went away with a light torch, a knife and a whistle, so we could hear from further apart if they were in trouble. They took one each. We remained seated inside the shelter, which was nothing more than a couple of tarps held by sticks near a big boulder, silent and fucking scared. I remember hearing quite a lot of sobbing around me. I was thinking I didn't want to die here. One of the girls suggested that we could sing to try and think of something else. Some disapproved because we might not hear the whistles, but we did anyway, although not very loud. We spent like this for about 10 to 20 minutes. The whistle interrupted our singing. We heard it clearly, 2 whistles coming towards us at a really fast pace. I remember taking my knife from its sheath and keeping it in my hands. Luckily, it was our friends. They arrived nervous and exhausted from the run. They told us that they had stumbled upon a long stick standing with lots of blood all over it, more than what our nerves could stand. Most of us started crying, some prayed too. They told us they were going back to look for whoever was in the mountains with us and confront him. In case things go bad, we'll run somewhere else so he can't find you, one said. We asked them to stay, but nobody was able to move a finger to actually stop them from leaving. There was no more singing, only weeping and barely audible prayers. I just didn't want to die there. I wanted to see my family. After a while, we heard some noises, followed by the voices of our friends. They came back at a calm pace, with relief in their faces. It was all just a misunderstanding, one explained. It's just the park ranger. We found him, and he explained to us that he was just walking around as part of his duty, said the other. And the bloody stick was just from a rabbit he had hunted for dinner. It was quite a relief. We relaxed. Someone even spoke about taking out our sleeping bags and going to sleep. That sounded wonderful. But it wasn't long until one of the older guys said that he was a bit suspicious. You see, he wasn't wearing a uniform, he said. Nor a badge, or anything that could identify him as a ranger, said the other. And who fucking walks kilometers away from the closest road, late at night, to hunt rabbits? Are there even rabbits in this altitude? Terror came back in a second. They were right. That story didn't make any sense. Let's go back there to fucking kill him, one of the older guys said. We asked them to stay with us again and got the same result. Once they were gone, someone said that maybe they had followed them and now knew exactly where we were. We all shivered in panic. Nobody was paying the slightest attention to anyone else anymore. Nobody cried and nobody prayed. I remember I only had one thought in my mind. I'd rather be killed than killed in this fucking place. We waited, seated, silent and ready to fight for our lives. We all had our knives out and ready. Minutes passed. Suddenly, we heard people running, approaching. We heard screams of terror. From the sound, it was obvious that there were more than 2 people coming at us. I haven't been more scared in my life. I hoped I could say goodbye to my mum, my dad and my sister. My knife was ready to stab whoever came close to me. We finally saw our 2 friends running for their lives, being followed by 2 men. They came just at the front of the opening of the shelter and stopped. The 2 men chasing them did the same, and we could see their faces. They were our camp leaders, who had been following us all the time, but hiding. And then the 4 of them started laughing at us and asking if we were scared. It was all apparently just a big joke. All this fucking time. Everyone started crying, and some even had problems to grasp proper breaths due to anxiety for quite a while. We were not amused at all, and only after a couple of minutes the funny 4 realized what they had done. They'd taken 13 children to the point of holding a knife and being willing to kill with it. We obviously relaxed a lot, but our fear became anger. It had been a joke, way out of proportion or the most basic common sense. They spent quite a while saying how sorry they were. We didn't care. We wanted them to leave us alone, but on the other hand, we were still too scared to sleep on our own, so we reluctantly accepted that they all come and sleep with us. It took them months to regain our trust. It was the worst night of my life, no doubts.
Number 4.
My dad is a journalist and a non-fiction writer, but at the time was a reporter for the Virginian Pilot based out of Virginia. He was working on a new book titled The Big Roads when this occurred. We often went on road trips for his research needs, and once his proposal for this new book was accepted, we went on a cross-country road from Virginia to California and back on old Route 66 for the book. Me being 13 at the time, I demanded that he let me bring a friend along, and so we were 3. The first quarter of our month-long adventure went off without a hitch. We stayed in motels, with the occasional stay at a grand old historic hotel. My dad being the outdoors man that he is, he decided that we should camp out about 5 or 6 times throughout the trip. The first night that we camped out, we were literally in the middle of nowhere. No one for at least 20 miles on either side in the middle of the Utah desert. When we arrived at our campsite in our rented minivan, my dad wanted to explore a bit because at the bottom of the hill that our campsite was situated on was an old Pony Express stop. My friend decided to stay in the minivan until my dad and I finished checking out the Pony Express stop to set up camp on our account of all the wasps and bees. We were utterly alone, and as a rather jumpy and skittish 13-year-old girl, it became apparent that we were isolated to the point that, if anything happened, we would be screwed. That's all I could think about as my dad and I walked down the hill to explore. We checked out the old station and everything was going smoothly until we were about halfway back up the hill. A large truck that we noticed driving down the old dirt road a few minutes before. We were surprised but really didn't think anything of it. Maybe this guy was on an adventure too. The truck parked halfway up the road and a man got out. He had what I think was a hunting rifle and started hunting around the area my dad and I were in, about 50 feet from our campsite. Of course, this was an absolute no hunting zone. My dad became a bit concerned because my friend was closer to the adventure than she was to us. He yelled out to the man, saying that there were children around and that he couldn't hunt there. As soon as the man turned to face us, I got an overwhelming sense of complete doom. I felt in my entire body that something was not right. The man looked us over and without saying a word, aimed his gun at us. My dad does not carry a gun or a knife or any kind of a weapon. I felt trapped. My dad ushered me behind a large boulder, but he didn't hide. He stood his ground. There was a solid minute of this man aiming his gun at my dad, and my dad standing completely still, staring back. In my mind, I considered all of the ways that this could go down. I was absolutely terrified that this guy would shoot my dad, and somehow me and my friend would have to escape or get murdered during this tense minute. The guy lowered his gun, cocked his head to the side, and pointed at my dad using the fake gun fingers, and then took a fake shot. He got in his truck and sped away. That night, my friend and I slept in the minivan at a 90-degree heat, because I was positive that this guy would come back and murder us all. He didn't come back, and a few other creepy incidents occurred on that trip, but we were fine and safe after all.
Number 5.
I grew up in a small coal town in the Appalachian Mountains on the side of one of the mountains that borders the valley of the town. It was a wonderful place for an outdoorsy kid. We had no immediate neighbors and acres of woods to play in. Above our house was a ridge that ran along the border of a state park, but all the trails and public areas were far in the valley below, separated by a thick forest and plenty of no trespassing signs, so we very rarely had hikers crossing over onto our land. From our house, there was a dirt road that wound up the mountain to the top of the ridge, where there stood the remains of a burnt-down cabin. From there, you could follow the ridge to a flat area popular with Dad's hunting friends, one of whom posted a trail cam during the off-season to monitor wildlife activity. From there, you could continue up the ridge to a clearing that hosted lots of flat boulders and a giant electrical tower that was fun to climb on. I'd adventure up there often with the family's black lab and spend hours reading, climbing, and generally enjoying the nature. One early fall day, when I was around 13 years old, I headed up there with a backpack full of snacks and a book. I'd taken care to avoid the trail cam, as it was the old film variety, and I'd gotten in trouble for inadvertently filling entire rolls of film goofing off in the area where it was posted. I reached my favourite rock at the edge of the clearing near the power lines, and had just settled down to read when Felicia started to bark and growl rather aggressively. At first, I paid no mind, as she loved to chase deer, but this time, she didn't bound off into the woods after her quarry. Instead, she stuck next to me, growling at something unseen in the thick tangle of brush and trees on the steep mountainside that faced the park. Now, I'd considered hiking down that way into the park on occasion, but it was an easy passage. The area had been cleared years before to install the electrical tower, and in its place had grown a thick mass of briars and weeds. The rocks that made for great climbing at the top of the ridge became difficult obstacles on the steep slopes below. Not to mention, there was much easier access closer to the park entrance. This way brought you down to an undeveloped area at the very back of the campgrounds that wasn't easily accessible to cars or hikers. So, I was taken off guard to see a man fighting his way through the brush from that direction. Nervously, I called out, "Hello?" and gripped Felicia's collar. She had a tendency to jump on people when she got excited, and I didn't want her to tumble him down the mountain. The man smiled, extracted himself from the thorns, and made his way up the hill to the base of my rock. I don't know if it was Felicia's reaction to him, or rather the remote and impossible way that he'd come from, but his presence made me uneasy. He seemed normal and friendly though. He was probably in his mid to late 20s, average height and build, and rather unremarkable looking. No backpack or supplies, but he was dressed as a hiker would be. I didn't like the way he looked at me, although at my young age I couldn't place why it unsettled me. As a grown woman, I can look back and realize that he was sizing me up. From his smile, he seemed to be pleased with what he saw.
"Hi there. Where'd you come from?"
He had no trace of an accent, which struck me as odd. Our area has a rather strong regional accent, and we don't get a lot of outsiders. "I live just down the hill. I was hiking with my dog."
"She seems like a nice dog,"
he told me, with no trace of irony. Felicia was snarling and vibrating with malice, but he seemed unconcerned.
"You should have her on a leash though. Wouldn't want to get in trouble with the park."
"We put her on a leash when we were in the park, but this part is our property." No reaction to learning that he was essentially trespassing.
"Still, you're so close. You don't know what you might run into up here."
"No one from the park comes up here," I told him. I was being a bit rude, but I was annoyed that some stranger was telling me what to do with my dog on my property.
"I'm from the park,"
he said, still grinning.
"I'm one of the rangers, and I wanted to see the property. What would you have done if she had attacked me? You could get in big trouble."
At this point, I immediately had chills run down my spine. We only had one ranger, and he was a close friend of the family. This guy was definitely not him. But I was afraid to let him know that I knew he was lying, so I dug out Felicia's leash and clipped her, then stood up, slinging my backpack on. "Sorry, we'll let you get on with your hike. I have to get home."
"Your parents know you're up here?"
"Oh yeah, they're expecting me soon."
"Do they come up here often?"
"Dad does. He comes up to check the trail cams." I improvised on a whim. This was the first time I saw the friendly stranger's smile falter.
"Trail cams?"
"Yes, there are lots up here. He and his friends like to hunt." The smile returned, but it was cold this time. "Well, these would make excellent hunting grounds." He took a step towards me, and Felicia lunged, nearly yanking the leash out of my hand. I managed to haul her back in time to keep her from tearing the man's smile right off of his face. He didn't so much as flinch.
"You should head back. Keep a tight hold on that leash now. Maybe I'll see you up here again soon, sometime."
"Yes, maybe," I said, secretly thinking to myself that I'd never fucking step foot into the woods again. "Well, bye." I quickly dragged Felicia away, looking back over my shoulder every now and then. He remained motionless in the spot where I'd left him, staring after me with that same fucking smile. Felicia growled over my shoulder a few times, and occasionally I heard branches snap behind me. But glancing back, I saw no sign of him following me. I cut straight across the clearing with the trail cam, not bothering to avoid it in my rush to get away from the stranger. Once we hit the road that led home, I unclipped Felicia from her leash and broke into a jog. She remained by my side until I got home. I didn't mention the strange man to my parents at first. They were worried about me hiking alone, and I didn't want them to forbid me. Furthermore, by the time I had gotten home, I had convinced myself that I'd overreacted to the whole thing. He was probably just a hiker and made up the bit about being a ranger to fuck with me since I was giving him an attitude. Still, I didn't hike back up the ridge that week and instead stuck to the woods below my house. At the end of the week, I came home from school to a pissed off dad, demanding to know if I'd messed with the trail cam. His buddy had come up to collect the film and discovered that the cam had been switched off, with only a few frames taken. At first, I was only concerned with getting in trouble and desperately professed innocence, and then I remembered the stranger. After telling Dad about him, at first he thought that I was making the story up to cover up messing with the cam. He called the park ranger to ask if there were a new ranger that we didn't know about. The ranger said no, but after hearing my story, he told Dad that the campground attendant had called an out-of-stater overnight in an unauthorized area back behind the campgrounds the previous weekend. He had assumed that the guy was trying to get out of the paying fee. Young guy, they'd said, average looking, very friendly, apologizing for what he'd said was a mistake, and then took off. Shortly afterwards, we heard from Dad's buddy with the trail cam. He had gotten the role developed, even though there were only a few frames filled up. The last one was of me and Felicia cutting across the clearing. Thank God I told the stranger that there were multiple cams. I imagine he gave up once he couldn't locate the other ones. My parents have since moved into a snug little neighborhood down in the valley, and I've moved out of town. In my parents' backyard, on the riverbank, there is a mound covered by Easter lilies that marks Felicia's final resting place. The house I grew up in fell into despair after it was sold, and was eventually burnt to the ground. No one lives on the property now, but the clearing at the top is still popular with hunters. When I'm home visiting for the holidays, I still like to hike up to the ridge. I wave at all the trail cams. Hey guys, it's that Grim Raider here. So, thank you very much for listening through that. I appreciate it. If you haven't subscribed, what are you doing? Come on, you've got to subscribe. I mean, you might as well just slap a like, just throw in a comment here and there, you know, just because you can, really. I mean, nothing's stopping you from doing it, right? Nah, but seriously, thank you very much for listening through. If you want to listen to more stories like this, on the screen, you can click on either video, that's the 2 previous videos, or you can go in the description and there's also a link to the previous video. There's also a playlist link which will lead you to a lot of videos very similar to this with hundreds of awesome stories like these. So yeah, with that I leave you with thank you very much, and you'll hear from me very soon.